Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. I'm also a faculty senior fellow at the Miller Center. On behalf of the Miller Center and the Statecraft Lab, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our discussion today, Breaking Silences, Lessons from Tulsa and Charlottesville. This program is part of the University of Virginia observance of the national holiday in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. First, I want those of you joining us to know that you're welcome to submit questions for our panel through the Q&A function to enhance our conversation. In May of 2021, President Joe Biden became the first president to commemorate the Tulsa Race Massacre, in which white mobs destroyed the all-Black Greenwood district, burning more than 1,000 businesses, churches, and homes, and murdering hundreds on May 31st, June 1st, 1921. Biden's acknowledgement of that horrific event came only after decades of struggle by survivors and local activists to break the silence of the cover-up of the massacre by Tulsa's white civic leaders. As I'm sure you all know, in August of 2017, the image of Charlottesville was transformed from a placid college town to a notorious international symbol of domestic violent extremism and white supremacist and anti-Jewish hatred. German Chancellor Angela Merkel condemned the deadly unrest in Charlottesville, and this is a quote from her. "It is racist, far-right violence and clear, forceful action that must be taken against it, regardless of where in the world it happens," end of quote. What are the lessons of the struggles over memory and demands for redress for the atrocities in Tulsa and Charlottesville for other cities confronting past atrocities or histories of injustice, such as Greensboro, North Carolina? Our panelists today have been deeply engaged with such questions, and we're thrilled that they can be here, albeit virtually, with us. Dr. Andrea Douglas is the Executive Director of the African American Heritage Center and the Bicentennial Professor of Law at the University of Virginia Law School. Dr. Douglas holds an MA and a PhD in art history from the University of Virginia and an MBA in arts management and finance from Binghamton University in New York. Douglas has also taught undergraduate and graduate classes in African American, contemporary, and art theory, and has published exhibition catalogs and scholarly articles. From 2004 to 2010, she was curator of collections and exhibitions and curator of contemporary art at the University of Virginia's Art Museum. Douglas was recently appointed to Governor Ralph Northam, the former governor, Ralph Northam's commission to study slavery and subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination. She is also the co-chair of the President's Commission on the Age of Segregation at the University of Virginia and sits on Monticello's Advisory Committee on African American Affairs, as well as the state's History of Lynching in Virginia Working Group. She has served on the City of Charlottesville Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Monuments, and Public Spaces, and also the University of Virginia President's Commission on Slavery, and she was chair of the city's Place Design Task Force. Our other speaker today is Dr. Scott Ellsworth. Dr. Ellsworth teaches in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, where he's been since 2007. He teaches courses on African American history, Southern Literature, Race and Sports, and Crime and Justice in the Contemporary United States. Trained as a historian, he received his PhD from Duke University, where he was a member of the Duke Oral History Project. Dr. Ellsworth is the author of Death in a Promised Land, the first ever comprehensive history of the horrific 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, published in 1992. Dr. Ellsworth is currently working with the ongoing effort to uncover the unmarked graves of massacre victims in Tulsa. Formerly a historian with the Smithsonian Institution, he has written about American history for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and other outlets, and has appeared on National Public Radio, The Today Show, PBS's The American Experience, the History Channel, the BBC, and in both film and broadcast documentaries. His book, The Secret Game, won a 2016 PEN Book Award and was named by the Chicago Tribune as one of the top 10 books of the year. His most recent book is The Groundbreaking, An American City and Its Search for Justice. And it's about Tulsa. It was released in May 2021 on the 100th year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Thank you for joining us, Andrea Douglas and Scott Ellsworth. Tulsa, yes. While Tulsa and Charlottesville have been well publicized recently as two cities whose troubled histories of white supremacy, have certainly gone around the world. Each one of these cities, Tulsa and Charlottesville, is its own unique case. So I thought we would begin by asking both of you to provide a brief overview of what happened in each of these places and also the historical context for those events. Dr. Douglas?
Yeah, I think that, when we think about 2017, we have to really think about an arc. And a lot of this began in 2015 with the sort of converging of a couple of events that happened all at the same time. Number one being Danville and the removal of the Confederate flags in front of the museum in Danville. The other being the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. We cannot really contextualize this without even thinking about Trump's campaign that he was running at the time. This highly racist campaign that energized groups across the country. And then also ultimately in Virginia, when Terry McAuliffe, or during the General Assembly, when they put forth a bill that would allow localities to make decisions about what could happen with their Confederate monuments. Also at the same time was a young woman named Ziona Bryant, who at the time was in the 9th grade, working on a project for a class that ultimately ended up in a petition around those statues in Charlottesville, particularly the Lee statue in what was called Lee Park at the time. 700 people signed that petition, and essentially in it, Ziona Bryant said that she felt that those statues in those public spaces limited her ability to move around, certainly in that park, freely because of their symbolism. So when you think about all of that convergence, there was an announcement made by Wes Bellamy, who was on city council at that time, and announcing the idea of removing that statue. Now, that idea was not a new idea. It had been brought by Kristen Zakos several years earlier than that, when she was part of a conversation at the Virginia Book Festival, where she brought up the notion that Charlottesville had not just one, but essentially 3 major, and I say Charlottesville, Albemarle County when I say 3, major statues, Confederate statues in its midst. And then 2 statues that were about Native erasure. And so we already had sort of a really dense visual, public, symbolic space of a kind of narrative that was about, ultimately, we come to understand white supremacy. And so the conversation that led to 2017 began, easily 2 years before. I was a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission that was formed in 2016 that met for 6 months. And that commission was created to consider those monuments. So it was the Blue Ribbon Commission on race, public spaces, and monuments. And that commission deliberated for about 6 months. It presented its report in December, and one of the recommendations was to remove the statues. All right, so all of this kind of building up to Charlottesville then becoming a kind of epicenter of conversation about these kinds of symbols. Simultaneously, there was a movement by the alt-right, particularly Richard Spencer, who was kind of going around the country recruiting young white men who had a particular ideology about whiteness and the role of whiteness in America. And so, when we think about 2017, August, we also have to think about what happened in March in Charlottesville in 2017, what happened in May in 2017, where they congregated in the Lee Park in front of the local singular Jewish synagogue. And then also what happened in July of that year when the Ku Klux Klan came to Charlottesville. So 2017 in many ways was a crescendo moment, but it certainly was a buildup of a set of activities that were happening. The Blue Ribbon Commission or the City Council ultimately voted to remove statues. And in that same night, also voted to cover the statues in response to violence. And so, as we start to think about what was happening in Charlottesville, also at the same time was the creation of a Black Lives Matter movement that was happening. There was also the creation of an organization called Surge in Charlottesville, which is a national organization, which was an anti-racist organization. And those two groups were coming together during those commission meetings. And that, I think, in real sense, was the burgeoning of the counter activist movement that through 2017 engaged with what we understand to be white supremacists, neo-Nazis, neo-Confederates that were meeting in our public spaces, planning what happened in August of 2017. So I think there was a long arc that we talk about that ultimately ends up on August 11th with the torch rally, walking through the grounds, that hollowed space that we also here think of as another sort of symbol to whiteness. And then the violence that happened around the Thomas Jefferson statue, where young student activists and others were injured as they were being circled and by that group of almost 300, followed the next day by the Unite the Right rally that then ultimately by the middle of that afternoon ended in the murder of Heather Heyer by Fields, who drove his car down 4th Street into a group of protesters. So I think we can see that as a really, 2-year event as opposed to a singular moment.
Thank you. The one thing I would add to that is that civil rights activists throughout the South, in Charlottesville and elsewhere, in particular, South Carolina, have been involved in a campaign to remove Confederate monuments as well as the Confederate flag placed on State House grounds. And of course, in South Carolina, after the massacre in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, there was a huge movement to remove the Confederate flag on the South Carolina State House grounds.
Exactly.
And that was successful.
Exactly.
And so I think that's a really important sort of precursor to what happened in Charlottesville.
Yeah, that ultimately was really sort of the incendiary movement, I would argue, or add to that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Let's turn to Dr. Ellsworth. There's always a story to how civil order deteriorates and how communal violence erupts. These kinds of race riots just don't happen out of nowhere. And when we say race riots, we're really talking about white mobs terrorizing African Americans in their communities. And that's been a common occurrence in US history. So tell us what happened in Tulsa on May 31st, 1921, and the events that led up to it.
Certainly, it's always a challenge trying to tell a story like Tulsa in a shorthand view, but I will do it. Andrea, that was really terrific what you just laid out for Charlottesville. So I think it's important to remember first the context of the times. The years around World War I are extremely perilous times for African Americans. Race relations are poor. This is an era of the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915, which is no longer just a Southern outfit, but it's a national organization. Lynchings are still happening in the United States. While the number of lynchings is starting to decline, the barbarity of the lynchings has increased. The U.S. in the early decades of the 20th century is one of the few countries in the world where people were burned at the stake. You have the rise of Jim Crow legislation and practices in the North, in previously integrated restaurants and whatnot. And you also have these, what were known in those days as race riots, where normally there's some sort of a racial incident involving Africans, Americans, and whites that then leads to whites attacking blacks in downtown areas and whites invading African American neighborhoods with intent of looting, burning, and murder. So these are all flying in the air, and this is part of the atmosphere in Tulsa. But Tulsa is a complicated place. It's this boom town. In the year 1900, there were less than 1,000 people in Tulsa. In 1920, there were 100,000 people, 20-story skyscrapers, the whole works. And the reason is oil. And money is flowing into Tulsa, rivers of money. It also flows into the city's African-American community known as Greenwood, very prosperous community. But also hanging over the city is crime. Like many boom cities, there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of theft, there's a lot of robbery. Then in 1920, a white 18-year-old accused teenager was lynched by a white lynch mob. He was handed over by the white sheriff to the lynch mob. The Tulsa police were conveniently absent. This young man was murdered. And then in the days that followed, the city's public leaders, the mayor, the chief of police, the leading editors of the white newspapers, all praised the lynching, saying that this shows the lawless element that the law-abiding citizens of Tulsa are not going to put up with this. So this is in the atmosphere. And so on Monday, Memorial Day, May 30th, 1921, there's an incident in an elevator in downtown Tulsa. A 19-year-old shoe shiner named Dick Rowland has entered the Drexel building to ride the elevator to the top floor to use a, quote, Negro bathroom. This is something he and the other black shoe shiners would do once a day. Nothing unusual about that. But something happens. We think he tripped as he entered the elevator and shot out his hands to break his fall. In those days, elevators weren't automatic, but had an operator. The elevator operator was a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. We think that Rowland probably caught her shoulder as he's trying to break his fall, might have torn her dress a little bit. She screamed. He ran out of the elevator. The Tulsa police were summoned, but they didn't seem to be particularly upset about this. Not concerned. They don't put out an all points bulletin. There was a white clerk in a nearby clothing store who had heard the scream, saw an African-American male running from the building. He concluded that this was an interracial rape attempt. The next morning, the police arrest Rowland. They bring him into the courthouse, put him in a jail on the top floor, the same jail where this young white accused murderer had been held before he was lynched a year before. And the wheels of justice seem to be turning, quietly, even Jim Crow justice. Sarah Page will not press charges ultimately. Rowland will be exonerated. But a reporter for the white afternoon newspaper, the Tulsa Tribune, caught wind of the story. And on their first edition that came out at 3:30 that afternoon, they had a front page account that claimed that Rowland wouldn't give his name to the police. He said his name was Diamond Dick. He had a diamond stick pin. He had been seen stalking Sarah Page, and that he had clearly attempted to rape her. There was also a now lost infamous editorial titled "To Lynch Negro Tonight." The Tribune hits the streets. By 4 o'clock, there's lynch talk on the streets of Tulsa. A lynch mob starts to gather, whites outside the courthouse where Rowland is held. 100, 200, 300, 400 people, women and children, as well as men. The Tulsa police force, once again, is nowhere to be found, but there's a new sheriff, and this sheriff is determined that Rowland is not going to be lynched. He disables the elevators in the courthouse, blockades the stairwells. He's got a handful of deputies. He puts them on the roof with high-powered rifles. Meanwhile, word hits Greenwood that this brother is in great terror, in great danger. Black World War I vet jumps on stage at one of the theaters in Greenwood and announces, "Shut this place down. We ain't going to let this happen here. There ain't going to be a lynching." African Americans start to gather in the Black commercial district to discuss their options. Everyone needs to remember, of course, there's no internet, there's no cell phones, there's no television, there's no radio, there's hardly any telephone. So everything is word of mouth. At 7 o'clock, as the lynch mob has grown, 700, 800, and on, a group of 25 Black World War I vets, most of whom have put on their old Army uniforms, all of whom are armed with rifles, pistols, and shotguns, get into cars, drive down to the courthouse, present themselves to the sheriff, say, "We are here to help you protect the prisoner. If you want us," the sheriff tells them to get away, to get the hell out of here. They go back to Greenwood, but their presence enrages and electrifies the white lynch mob. How dare these men, these subhuman men, try to stop us in what we are rightfully about to do. Members of the mob go home and get armed. They get others to come. A group tries to break into the National Guard Armory to get the Springfield rifles. They're prevented from doing so. The mob continues to grow. Rumors fly. Then at 9 o'clock, a rumor hits Greenwood that the white mob is storming the courthouse. They were not. This time, 75 African-American vets go down, repeat the visit, present themselves as sheriff, are turned away. As they're leaving, an elderly white man tries to wrestle a gun away from a black vet who had fought in France. A shot went off and the massacre begins. A lot happens immediately. The white Tulsa police force suddenly shows up, but instead of dispersing the lynch mob, they deputize members of the mob as special deputies. White police officers also break into sporting goods stores and pawn shops to gain access to the guns for sale there, and they start handing them out to mob members saying, "Get a gun and get a Negro." There are drive-by shootings that are made by whites piling into cars, roaring down, residential streets in Greenwood, firing into, children's bedrooms, living rooms, whatnot. There are early efforts to sort of invade the African-American commercial district, but those are successfully fought off by Black residents. There's not a lot of sweet street lights. They shoot them off and they're able to defend their neighborhoods. So by 2 o'clock in the morning and African-Americans, some are already leaving town. By 2 o'clock in the morning on January 1st or June 1st, it seems like everything is over. And some Black folks, their shoulders go down. The sun's going to come up in a few hours, and this thing will be gone. But what they didn't know is whites were organizing. So while that's going on, white men are going into all-night cafes and speakeasies. Groups are gathering at different intersections, and they make a plan to invade Greenwood at dawn. So right before dawn, there are thousands of whites gathered across railroad tracks from Greenwood, the Black community. shortly after dawn, some sort of a factory whistle or something. We still don't know exactly what it was, which was a signal for the mob to begin the invasion. And the invasion happens. And it's fairly systematic. Any African Americans who fight back are killed. And there are furious firefights by groups of African Americans to defend the community. Others are arrested by mob members, by police officers, by National Guard troops, and taken to hastily created internment camps at the baseball park and fairgrounds. And block by block, this mob goes. And they will break into homes and businesses, loot them, and then set them on fire. And there are furious firefights. There are new dangers to African Americans as well, this time from the air. There weren't a lot of airplanes in Tulsa at the time, probably a half dozen, but there's solid evidence that at least one of these planes, and think a World War I era biplane, dropped sticks of dynamite onto Greenwood. The local white National Guard troops also get drawn into the fighting as a part of the rioters. They turn their machine guns on black churches, on black defenders. Finally, state troops arrive from Oklahoma City in the morning on June 1st, but it's too late. Greenwood has been destroyed. 1,100 homes and businesses, 36 restaurants, a school, 2 theaters, 25 meat markets and groceries, a black hospital, a black library branch, post office, and whatnot. In the aftermath of the massacre, well, I'll talk about that later on, but this was the single, worst incident of racial violence in American history. We still, to this day, don't know how many people died. I think reasonable estimates go from somewhere in the 70s to perhaps as high as 300, but we don't know if the number is 79 or 299, and we don't even know what the ratio of black to white casualties is.
Yes, thank you. A few things jumped out at me when you were speaking, Dr. Ellsworth. The first is that this was a thriving, prosperous Black community that was just leveled and destroyed. The second is the role of the press in the local press in summoning the mob, and really, sort of working against efforts by local law enforcement, it seems, to try to, sort of tamp down the emotion and try to maintain order. And the third is how the image of empowered Black men, these veterans of World War I, become a lightning rod for, white vengeance, the mob's vengeance. Throughout the South, there was a surge in communal violence after World War I, when many of these African-American troops who fought in World War I returned home. And it seems like Tulsa fits within that sort of more broader story as well. So, Dr. Ellsworth, tell us about your book. In your book, The Groundbreaking, you tell the story not only of the massacre that you just laid out, but you also talk about the concerted effort by civic leaders in Tulsa to completely erase the massacre from public record and memory. If you could just talk about that.
Sure. So briefly, the massacre was front page news in the New York Times. It made the Times of London. It made the Times of India. It was a big news stories. And Tulsa's white city fathers, the businessmen and politicians who ran the city, realized they had a big PR problem. And so what they did is they first announced that white Tulsans were sorry as to what had happened, that they would rebuild the Black community, and sent that message out. They didn't do that. What they tried to do was to steal the land where the Black commercial district was, and to use that to build a new a Union Railway station. African Americans defeated that effort in court. Black lawyers did. And African Americans went ahead and rebuilt their community anyway. Remember, there's a lot of money in Tulsa, and a lot of it started flowing again. But an all-white grand jury was impaneled. They blamed Blacks for the massacre, and no single white person spent an hour in a day in prison for any of the things. But what's amazing is how quickly that the massacre was swept under the table and buried. The chief of police sent his officers to the white photography studios in town to confiscate any photographs of the massacre. It was difficult for decades to find any. You can find them online easily today. But Tulsa's two white daily newspapers for 50 years refused to write about the massacre. Researchers who attempted to study the massacre and write about it as late as the 1970s had their lives threatened. It was just something that you just did not talk about, and something that was very much kept under wraps. It wasn't taught, all of that. There was an irony, though, in that in the African-American community, the massacre was also not discussed as a whole in the public sphere. Now, there were some survivors who fought to keep the story alive, but I think it's important to think of massacre survivors. You can compare them to combat veterans, but also, more importantly, to Holocaust survivors. Many of those folks did not want to burden their children and grandchildren with these traumatic memories, and they just didn't talk about it. On the 25th anniversary of the riot, Black Tulsa's newspaper, the Oklahoma Eagle, they had one sentence about the massacre and didn't even mention that it happened in Tulsa. So by the late 60s, however, that taboo had been broken, and it's taken us about 45 years since then to finally get the story out. My book, this new book, The Groundbreaking, here's the commercial. It does tell about the massacre. It tells how it was covered up. It tells about this courageous group of survivors and white eyewitnesses who refused to let this story die. And it's really because of them that we know what happened.
Yeah, I can attest. It's a wonderful book, and it shows how long you have been thinking and working about these events in Tulsa and trying to bring them to the public. So I highly recommend the book. Dr. Douglas, a somewhat similar question. A lot of my students at UVA think of Charlottesville as this liberal city, but like many other places in the South, Charlottesville struggles with the history of slavery and segregation in Virginia and throughout the region. And we've talked about the existence of these Confederate monuments as really sort of lightning rods and causes of the chaos that erupted in August of 2017. And those monuments were really established by the civic elite, sort of the counterpart in Charlottesville of the city fathers in Tulsa who wanted to silence or erase the Tulsa Race Massacre. So in Charlottesville, you have this imposition of a one-sided history by civic leaders, the press, the clergy, and it's reflected in segregated schools, housing, and public life. So there's a deep history of racial segregation in Charlottesville behind all the unrest that we all know about. And that also entailed a level of whitewashing and silencing of certain historical perspectives. So Dr. Douglas, when did the civil rights movement come to Charlottesville? And how far-reaching were the changes that it brought?
Well, I can answer that question in a couple of ways, and because the work that we do at the Heritage Center, when you talk about the whitewashing of a history, I often say that you can rethink Reconstruction and Charlottesville's even role in that. In a way that allows us to understand that the civil rights movement begins in Charlottesville in 1866, right? We want to sort of think about a modern civil rights movement, but in 1866, 52% of the population was African-American. And within that population was a burgeoning sort of middle class already. There were 600 free Blacks living in Charlottesville. So as the state of Virginia is thinking about its constitution, its 1868 constitution, James T.S. Taylor in 1867, who is a member of the Charlottesville community, is one of the delegates, all right? And, there is a meeting that happens in 1866 where the African-American male community comes together and says, hey, if you want our vote, we have 8 total demands. And those demands include things like not being deprived of the vote. They are demanding that they have the right to hold office, that they have the right to community schools, that they have the right to not be subjected to corporal punishment, not to be subjected to the poll tax, right? And so that is a very decisive moment of Black activism that ultimately results in this idea that if you want our vote, these are the things that we demand as we begin to build our community. And as I'm listening to Scott even describe Tulsa, you know, as we start to think about African-American communities and how they develop in the South, Charlottesville is also one of those communities. By 1888, it is also seeing an economic boom where the African-American community also sees an economic boom. And so, you know, the notion of business prosperity and communal engagement that allows for Black people to buy property, to build schools, all of that, that's part of Charlottesville's history as well. And so, you know, we want to think about massive resistance, for instance, as the modern civil rights movement, but it really goes much further than back to that. I also want to highlight the fact that, you know, Charlottesville was petitioning for a NAACP chapter in 1918, you know, and there were 44 members that signed for that chapter in 1918. 1921, we also see a community coming together and demanding a high school as a consequence of petition. 1949, actually in 1942, you begin to see the movement, certainly as a consequence of Black activism in the university hospital for wages, living wages. And they're engaging in collective bargaining in a state where there is no opportunity for collective bargaining, right? And they force UVA to create a space of not, you know, moving from $3 a month to $7 a month or something like that, right? So as we start to sort of chart that, that's, if you talk about the unknown story, that is, you know, the line of Black activism and civil rights movement. 1921, as we start to think about, you know, the 19th Amendment, you see African-American women, even though they're not able to vote, signing up to register to vote. So Charlottesville's African-American community has always had for itself this line through of activism that by the time you get to 1954, 55, when the NAACP goes from 96 members to almost over 1,000 members as a consequence, that then leads to the response by the NAACP here to integrate schools. And that was what we then describe as a civil rights movement. We really can say that the burgeoning of the Black community is an act of activism itself. And that history is just something that we're just now starting to uncover in real terms. And even as you start to think about how is it possible that, you know, August 27th occurred, you know, within a week of the events of Saturday, there was a council meeting. And it was activists who stood up in the council meeting that demanded that city business not just occur. And so had that vein of activism not been there, we may be now talking about a kind of erasure, because Charlottesville wanted to go back to normal. The tenor of the conversation in some aspects of the community was this was an invasion, as if racism didn't exist in this community and still doesn't exist in this community. So the need for us to sort of have conversations about normalcy and to redefine normalcy in the perspective of us all getting along probably could have occurred had the activists not been in the council chambers a week after August 2017. And so I think that's also really important as we chart the question that you asked me: when does activism begin in this community? And the Black community, we would not live the way we live in Charlottesville had it not been for the response of the immediate response at every level of the African American community here.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. I'm so glad that you sketched that longer history of Black activism in Charlottesville, and also talked about the civil rights movement that we don't talk about enough, which is the Black activism and Black demands for civil rights and citizenship after emancipation and during Reconstruction in the late 19th century. That really, I think, is a crucial context, another crucial context for the discussion that we're having today.
Mm-hmm. And I want to add also too, the sort of reactionary, when you think about Tulsa in some ways is a reactionary. That mob violence is reactionary. It's reactionary to the success of Black people. I enjoy Scott's description of the ways in which, in some ways, the white community was jealous almost of Black social development, economic development. There's a similar vein here in Charlottesville in terms of the kinds of laws that are created, and even in the placement of those symbols of white supremacy that are those statues. So, I've been reading the book, by the way, Scott, and I've been enjoying it. So there are places that are resonating for me quite well in the conversation.
Thank you.
Scott, did you have anything to add?
Not so much. I think you're going to ask me about what we're up to today, and I'll let you do that. But what Andrea has done just so eloquently and importantly is she's shown how whatever these events are, they don't generally just come poof out of the air. There's a lot of precedents that build them. And it's also the importance of little acts by people, smaller, seemingly less important acts that can have great resonances along the way. And that certainly happened in Tulsa as well.
Okay, thank you both. Both of you are involved currently in efforts in your respective cities to confront the past and break silences and educate the public about what happened in Charlottesville and Tulsa, and really in hopes that such violence and inhumanity will never occur again. So, Scott, could you describe the current efforts to locate the mass graves of the victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre?
I will, but I want to tell you briefly how that all happened. So, so by the 1980s, the story was starting to come out a little bit. My first book actually came out in 1982. Okay.
Oh,
but we had a big breakthrough happened in 1995, ironically, as a result of another tragedy, which was the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City in 1995. That was the largest, quote, act of terrorism on American soil prior to 9/11. The Today Show flew its entire crew from New York to broadcast live from Oklahoma City for a week. The host of the Today Show was Bryant Gumbel, the first African-American, national news host. During that week, a brilliant former journalist and state legislator representing Greenwood in Tulsa, Don Ross, went up to Mr. Gumbel and said, as horrible as this bombing is, there's another story. It's never gotten the national attention it needs to. And Ross gave Gumbel a copy of Death in a Promised Land. 10 days later, Don and I both heard from producers at the Today Show saying on the 75th anniversary, the Today Show would do a story about it. This was the first national news story about the massacre, aside from an op-ed in the Washington Post about my book, since the 1920s, okay? So when that happens, certain things got going. A Black Wall Street Memorial was created. The Today Show came, they interviewed me, they interviewed a bunch of survivors as well, too. And about 10 days when the story was in the can, but before it happened, I realized, well, shoot, if we can get the Today Show to do that, we can leverage that to get more coverage. So I got on the phone, and in 3 days, I got the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, the Associated Press, and I think UPI was still in business, all to do stories. We had a front page above the fold story in the Washington Post. We had a 3/4 page story in the New York Times. Don Ross, the legislator, then brilliantly took all of this news coverage to the governor and the state legislature and convinced them to create a Tulsa Race Riot Commission to study the event. That happened. The commission voted for a couple of things happened during that time with the encouragement of the survivor community. I, with a lot of other people, began the search for the mass graves. But also the commission voted that the state of Oklahoma should pay reparations to the then 150 known survivors. The state legislature refused to do that. Instead, they gave them each a gold-plated medal. After that, Dr. Charles Ogletree at the Harvard Law School, African-American attorney, launched a reparations, a lawsuit seeking restitution for these survivors. That lawsuit made it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, but they refused to do it. So our first mass grave investigation was shut down until 2 years ago. The current mayor of Tulsa reopened it. We are at it again. We've made 2 excavations. The first one came up with nothing. The second one, we found bodies of African Americans who are not where they should be. We're extracting DNA, at least in one individual. He was killed by gunfire. He's buried in an area where we know mass massacre victims are buried. It's our hope to continue that work this summer. Meanwhile, there is a new lawsuit on behalf of the 3 living survivors of the massacre, also their family members, to seek financial restitution. So the point of this is a couple things, is that, as William Faulkner famously said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. The Tulsa Race Massacre still casts a shadow over the city of Tulsa. This past summer, National Geographic magazine did a study. They estimated if the massacre had not happened, that there would have been an additional $630 million worth of generational wealth in Greenwood today. That's generations of, house down payments, seed money for new businesses, college tuition, childcare, elder care, all of that. Lifespan, the average lifespan of Black Tulsans is 10 years less than white Tulsans, and all of that. So this history is not gone. We're still dealing with it, and we still need to.
Thank you, Scott. And Dr. Douglas, if you could tell us about your own efforts to, educate the public about Charlottesville's history, and in particular, your Swords into Plowshares project.
Yeah, my colleague, who's a university professor, Dr. Jelaine Schmidt, and I have been working very closely for the last few years on really trying to educate our community. And largely coming out of some of the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission, one of them being that we would participate in the Equal Justice Initiative's Community Remembrance Project. There was a lynching here in Charlottesville in 1898 of John Henry James out in Albemarle County. And so we took 100 people on what we called our civil rights pilgrimage, which really was to insert Charlottesville history, 2017's history, into the long arc of racial violence, American racial violence, and really sort of bring that into light. And so 100 people from the community came with us on this tour where we brought John Henry James's soil into the Equal Justice Initiative and exhibition. And so that vessel is there. We then engaged in a sort of community-wide education about statues. Dr. Schmidt and I weekly, monthly, sort of engaged in public history, really talking about the moment when those objects were placed and what was the rhetoric around that. And Swords into Plowshares comes in some ways out of that now 2-year process and trying to bring the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission into our continued public life. Because, often a commission is formed and they write a report and the report then goes on the shelf. And we were determined to make sure that that didn't happen. So once the General Assembly made it possible ultimately for communities to make decisions about their statues, once the Virginia Supreme Court declared that Charlottesville's monuments were not subject to the old ordinance that said that you could not deface or move or remove objects, and that the new ordinance allowed that to be the decision of a locality, the Heritage Center made an application to receive the Lee statue. And our application, entitled Swords into Plowshares, basically takes a verse from Isaiah and says, we will turn, these implements of war into useful objects, swords into plowshares. And so our idea is to take the Lee monument, melt it down, turn it into ingots, and then allow, through a community engagement process about what public spaces should look like, what are our values, what are our equitable values, let that community engagement process define what happens to those ingots, right? And with the hope of giving voice to people who were not able to have voice at that moment where those statues were placed. Really allowing Charlottesville, who suffered trauma, real trauma, as a result of 2017, to also define for itself what its social values look like in the 21st century, as opposed to claiming 20th century values are unquestionable, undeniable. And so, that's what we're involved in. We're also involved in another civil rights pilgrimage. We'll have another one in June. We're taking another group of communities down, beginning in Birmingham and ending in Memphis, to really continue to educate Charlottesville about where we are in our overall racial history in America. And I think over the course of the last 2 years, we have come to cause people to really engage in the question of what is America? How do we, as a kind of epicenter of that description, want to speak to the world about what that looks like?
Thank you. I see a question coming in here that I'd like to share with both of you, since it does relate to both Tulsa and Charlottesville. But the question is directed to Dr. Douglas, and they want to know her thoughts about whether Charlottesville, like Tulsa, was the focus of violence and a longer history of racism because of the activism and the social progress achieved by the Black community there, which, according to the question, I'm going to try and paraphrase it, that Black economic self-reliance and independence could lead to a power that the white establishment didn't think that it could control. So it's just a question of maybe how similar is Charlottesville in the response of the white community, maybe not in a sort of an eruption of violence, but more systematically to what happened in Tulsa?
I think it's very similar. I mean, I think when you start to chart, for instance, in 1890, something is formed called the Piedmont Industrial Land Improvement Company. And the Piedmont Industrial Land Improvement Company allows for Black Charlottesville to buy property. So by the time you reach 1954, 49% of the African-American community in Charlottesville owns its own home, right? In 1911, there's an ordinance that is created in Charlottesville that follows an ordinance that's being developed in Richmond that essentially says, if a block is owned, the majority of the block is owned by Blacks, then no white person can purchase property, and vice versa, right? Then what happens after that, Charlottesville is too small a space to have redlining, but what we have here are are covenants that limit the spaces where African American people can occupy. So in the same way that Scott is talking about Black wealth and the ability to acquire Black wealth, once a piece of property goes into covenant, you know, Virginia has not did not pass the law to make those covenants removable until last year. So we have racial covenants that are limiting Black prosperity, right? And those racial covenants were covenants that came into our existence in our space, as we understand, thanks to work done by Karen Waters Wicks, as a consequence of members of city council who would then prosper from that, right? Because they were involved in buying real estate. So I think that while we don't have the kind of violence in 1921 that occurred in Tulsa, the African American community in 1921 was prospering, right? It was building its high school. The Jefferson School as a high school, the petition is signed in 1920, 1921. The school is ultimately built in 1926, and it becomes the source of Black education, a consistent democratic Black education, where all African American people at that point can now begin to go to school beyond the 8th grade, right? So I really think that as you start to chart the development of the African American community in Charlottesville, you always see this, as I said, response of the white community to limit that. And so the kinds of histories that we are uncovering here in the Heritage Center begin to point in those kinds of directions. In my mind, the reason why we get to a place where we're talking about statues and why Charlottesville becomes this place is because of that symbolic utterance that those objects make. In terms of even when they're placed just as Black people are beginning to prosper.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's emerging out of this discussion is the sense that, you know, even though what happened in Tulsa and Charlottesville may seem like, you know, extraordinary events, I think there's an underlying story to be told about efforts by white communities to try to block, you know, the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by Black communities. And you know, we have to see these events of white violence, mob violence, and resistance in a context of African American striving for full citizenship and really African American achievements of, you know, the possibilities of prosperity and organization and community. Well, we're really at the end of our time, and I want to thank both of our presenters, Dr. Andrea Douglas and Dr. Scott Ellsworth. You know, before Christmas, we lost Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa. And that commission provided a platform for survivors and victims of the brutal apartheid system to tell their stories about physical and emotional trauma. And we desperately need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States. We need commissions, really. And in order to have peace and reconciliation, and to avoid a repeat of the horrific events of Charlottesville and Tulsa and elsewhere, it's really imperative that we have honest public discussions, public accounts of the more painful episodes of our past. So again, I want to thank our panelists, Andrea Douglas and Scott Ellsworth, and thank all of you for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you.